at some stage there have been British historians who have argued that Britain shouldn't enter into the Second World War because Britain lost so much. Britain lost an empire, almost lost her independence, and that if only we had continued to appease Hitler, allow him to take Poland, allow him to be the hegemonic power in Eastern and Central Europe, then we would have kept our empire. Firstly, that's more than ahistorical because the empire was in systemic decline long before we got close to drawing swords with Hitler. But secondly, what Churchill realised, and this is why Britain's motivations for joining the Second World War were nothing to do with empire, was that what happens in another part of the world, even if it is not your traditional strategic concern, affects you. Poland, Czechoslovakia, these aren't places that are traditional British concerns. Ukraine now is not a traditional British concern. But there comes a moment where you say, well, if we don't draw the line here at Ukraine, where's next? And do we wake up too late when our own security is greatly threatened?
Tim Bouverie, welcome to Reaganism. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So you are the author of Allies at War, How the Struggles Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War and the World, published by Crown. Got a lot of attention, not only across the pond in the UK, but here in the United States. Congrats on your work. I know you were affiliated with St. Anthony's College in Oxford at the time of writing the book. There's so much ink that's been spilled on the Second World War, yet you decided to jump into it and impressively seem to have satisfied all the people who know something about World War II and its history by putting together a story with a sort of a different angle, looking at World War II through the lens of allies, not just military battles, or to the exclusion of military battles for the most part, and doing it in a narrative form and by pulling some interesting stuff out of the archives. I listened to a podcast you did with Andrew Roberts, the great biographer of Churchill, who seemed to be envious of what you found deep in those archives. So congrats on that, and tell us how you arrived at approaching the Second World War through this lens.
Well, my first book was on the lead-up to the Second World War, the appeasement policy in the 1930s, which was obviously overwhelmingly political and overwhelmingly diplomatic. And like you and like many listeners, I have read a lot of books about the Second World War, brilliant books, fascinating books, but too many of them, I thought, assume that once the war begins, this is all just a contest of men and tanks and aeroplanes, pitched battles, espionage, etc. Whereas politics carried on throughout the Second World War. If we were to try and look at the most fundamental reason why the Axis, that is, the Nazis and the Italian fascists and the Imperial Japanese, did not win the Second World War, it is because they were confronted by a superior coalition of nations and empires that combined their resources and coordinated their plans in order to thwart them. And that might sound very simple, and a lot of people, I think that that's axiomatic, that it was bound to happen, that the British Empire, the United States, the Soviet Union, and many other countries were going to come together in this great endeavour. But it wasn't. The anti-Axis alliance was highly sophisticated, highly integrated and collegiate, and ultimately conquering. But at the same time, it was suspicious, it was duplicitous, and it was rivalrous. And so one of the major inspirations for this book was to try and write about this duality, about how these powers are collaborating on one major common end, the defeat of Nazism, and yet have very, very different ideas about the post-war world.
Yeah, it's a great point, and important for this moment to think about allies and an axis. I mean, we're sitting here in 2025 after a bunch of generations seem to have learned from the Second World War, saying we ought to organize the world in such a fashion that we don't allow this sort of thing to happen again. But now we have this emerging axis of the People's Republic of China, of Russia, Iran, North Korea. And then we have sort of the Allies, the West, the free world as such. That's sort of trying to organize, but is often battling within itself. I mean, the most successful alliance in world history, I think, is NATO. And yet NATO is besotted by drama, and perhaps its entire history is filled with the competition and fights between allies. Yet the value proposition, which you point out, was obvious perhaps then, but hard to realize, was the totality of the allies was, if it came together, would defeat the Axis. I mean, you have this in your preface, it's kind of outline the financial, industrial, material resources of the Allies dwarf those of adversaries. You're right, in 1943 alone, the Allies produced nearly 3,000 naval vessels, over 60,000 tanks, I'm summarizing, nearly 150,000 aircraft, and it just dwarfed what the Nazis, the Italians, and Imperial Japan had, almost, kind of at least measured in naval vessels, like 4 or 5 to 1. But just because that kind of you add it all up, we can win, doesn't make that inevitable. And the conspiracies and the fights and the competition between the Allies was significant. I'm most interested in the relationship between the Great Britain and the United States. We'll talk about the Soviet Union and Stalin, but from the outset, I think everyone knew that was somewhat of a complicated member of the alliance, not only because they had made peace with Germany until Hitler broke that treaty, but because of the difference in the systems. But Churchill, of course, was half American, wasn't he? And it was sort of a relationship that you might think, without knowing the details, a more natural relationship. And in fact, it wasn't. It was hard. It was difficult from the beginning.
It was difficult. I think that one can say two things fundamentally about the Anglo-American alliance. On the one hand, this was the most successful military alliance in history. Without a doubt. It was the most sophisticated, the most collegiate, the most integrated, and the most successful. It succeeded in overcoming the most enormous military odds together. And as far as the military side is concerned, it really is an Anglo-American or British Commonwealth American alliance. The Soviet Union may be receiving a lot of military aid, munitions and raw materials from the West, but there aren't joint operations with the Red Army. So it is the British and the Americans that are fighting together, and they do so very well. At the same time, we have to get beyond the romance of the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship and realize some harsh things. One of which is that because of deep-seated American isolationism, which predated the First World War and then came back with a vengeance after it, most Americans were very suspicious about the British before the Battle of Britain, let's say. If you look at opinion polls at the time during the phony war, when there were all sorts of countries involved, including France, and Hitler's victims of recent time included Czechoslovakia and Poland, Britain ranked fairly far down the list of allies or potential allies that US citizens identified with. And this extended right up to the top. The British had an empire which the Americans disapproved with on both moral and political grounds, and also on economic grounds. The empire in those days was protected by a very robust series of tariffs, which it had been a very long-standing policy of the Roosevelt administration to dismantle. In those days, it was the Americans that were anti-tariffs and the British who were trying to protect their empire by tariffs. And I think if you were trying to extrapolate some sort of lesson by this, I think what you see is tariffs are generally what countries or empires try and impose when they're on the wane. It is a confident country that goes out and says, free trade, competition, I can beat that competition. And that's why the US was so keen to dismantle the British Empire's tariff system because they knew that the US would rule the commercial world, and they did for the next 80 years.
I want to go back to what you said a moment earlier. I mean, I think your insight on the tariffs and sort of the irony and how it's shifted, where the U.S. is today and the Trump administration today in terms of favoring tariffs, but a more confident emerging power. Free trade was something that benefited them and thought would be the opportunity to win, as opposed to the defensive game and trying to maintain status quo. But the skepticism that Americans had of Britain and of Britain being an ally based on World War I was something I hadn't fully internalized until reading your treatment. There's an excellent chapter here, The Battle for America, which I'll delve into here, which is, people viewed that the British propaganda had been responsible for what you write, hoodwinking the United States into joining the First World War. That is, this idea, and this is very relevant for right now, this idea that allies will work against your interests. Allies will hoodwink you. Allies will bring you into wars you don't want to fight. And that was a view strongly held by Americans after the First World War, represented some of the leading isolationists today, the American First elements of that time, who viewed Britain, and particularly Winston Churchill, with deep suspicion.
Certainly. And there are things which go back further than that. The British were always considered more perfidious than they were. The Americans thought they didn't get this empire by chance, and there's obviously a sort of redcoat tradition or fear of redcoat tradition. The idea that the British are super manipulators and are using all the tricks of ancient diplomacy, all the tricks which allowed them to accrue this vast, massive territory, to inveigle the US into the First World War, and that they're trying to do the same in the Second World War, and it's not helped by the fact that the British haven't paid back their First World War debts to the US in the interim. But this changes with the fall of France.
Yes.
American public opinion swings overwhelmingly behind the British war effort, and yet aid is not forthcoming for the simple reason that many Americans in senior positions don't think that the British are going to win, and they don't want to hand over a load of equipment which America needs for it to end up in the hands of the Nazis.
Well, everybody was shocked at the fall of France, right? I mean, this was sort of, including the British.
I don't think even Hitler expected France to fall in 6 weeks. We have to remember, this is the second largest army in Europe, and a nation which, along with the British, had held the Germans on the Western Front for 4 years between 1914 and 1918. It was a profound shock, and suddenly what has recently been described as a big, beautiful ocean didn't seem quite so big anymore. Suddenly, there was a major panic and a huge rearmament movement in America, well overdue. At the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, Switzerland and Belgium both had larger armies than the United States did.
This is a remarkable statement, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about U.S. policy between the wars and how it arrived at that. But the treaties, neutrality treaties and the like, you're right, there was only one tank brigade in the entire U.S. Army, while the U.S. Air Force possessed a mere 160 fighter planes and 52 heavy bombers at this time. And just nothing to speak of. And the notion, as you say, that Switzerland was a larger, more capable army than the United States, sort of unfathomable for Americans today. But that's where we were, and that was a choice, wasn't it?
It was a choice. I think it's a very healthy democratic tradition, not possible since America became the great superpower that it did during the Second World War. But I think it's a healthy democratic tradition, and Britain had it as well throughout the 18th century and the 19th century, that you don't have a permanent, large, standing army. You don't rely on this as other countries do. You don't militarize your society in the same way. You try and avoid war, but if war comes to you, you can raise an army from your civilian population, and that's what both the Americans and the British did in the First World War. But the great big beautiful ocean did count for something in those days. There were no immediate enemies anywhere near the United States. The Navy was substantial. The Navy was maintained between the wars, which was going to protect the US. And we have to also remember the appalling straits to which the US economy was going through from 1929 onwards, and right up to and including the Second World War. So, and one great challenge one has to put to those members of the American hard right at the moment, who seem to now, in their clamour for current isolationism, cast aspersions and doubts on American involvement in the Second World War. Apart from the morality of the case, apart from the strategic value of the case, apart from the Allies and the diplomacy, it was the Second World War, not the New Deal, that brought the American economy out of the Depression properly.
Interesting point there in terms of economic terms and what the Second World War did for the U.S. economy. But you did hit on something, which is this phenomenon, I guess I'll call it here in the United States, on the far right. Darryl Cooper is sort of the one that gets the attention with his appearance on Tucker Carlson, who has taken up what is all by all accounts an ahistorical argument that Churchill is the villain in World War II because he refused to compromise with Hitler, could have avoided the war, and then as a result, the United States could have avoided the war as well. Your colleague, Andrew Roberts, addressed this in an essay in the Wall Street Journal. I am curious how your analysis and your study, your deep dive into the archives of the alliance that came together to defeat Nazism and how Churchill and FDR came together sort of puts the exclamation point on what Andrew Roberts wrote and saying this is a bunch of bunk and of course Churchill's the hero here and the villain remains Hitler.
Well, the odd thing, Roger, is that at some stage there have been British historians who have argued that Britain shouldn't enter into the Second World War because Britain lost so much. Britain lost an empire, almost lost her independence, and that if only we had continued to appease Hitler, allow him to take Poland, allow him to be the hegemonic power in Eastern and Central Europe, then we would have kept our empire. Firstly, that's more than ahistorical because the empire was in systemic decline long before we got close to drawing swords with Hitler. But secondly, what Churchill realised, and this is why Britain's motivations for joining the Second World War were nothing to do with empire, was that what happens in another part of the world, even if it is not your traditional strategic concern, affects you. Poland, Czechoslovakia, these aren't places that are traditional British concerns. Ukraine now is not a traditional British concern. But there comes a moment where you say, well, if we don't draw the line here at Ukraine, where's next? And do we wake up too late when our own security is greatly threatened? And as for the United States lost just under 500,000 servicemen and women during the Second World War, which is, of course, an appalling tragedy. But in every other way, by every other metric, the United States gained enormously from this war. It is the war that absolutely cemented the US as the superpower par excellence, as the leading military power, the leading economic power. It was a moral cause with which the US should remain rightly proud for having taken part. And I would say to these gentlemen in America who cast doubt on why America got involved and why Churchill got involved, look at the panic that there was in America in the summer of 1940 when it looked like Britain was going to go under and that they were going to face a Nazified Europe. And that was at a time when the Atlantic Ocean counted for a lot more than it does today.
In terms of trade and commerce and the like. But describe that. Describe 1940. I mean, we're more than a year before Pearl Harbor, before the United States is ultimately drawn in. I mean, the Blitz is underway. I mean, if Churchill comes to power in that year, but this is, this is the West is lost, democracy is lost, freedom is lost. I mean, this is the Third Reich is basically is taking Western, the continent of Europe.
Of course, and anyone who thinks that the British should not have fought in 1940 and then regrets America fighting from 1941 onwards is effectively saying that two things, both naive and invidious. The invidious thing is that you are somehow okay with a large Nazi empire in the centre of Europe, and naive to think that it's just going to stay in the centre of Europe, that it's not going to move on for...
This is a key point, Tim. I mean, I didn't cut you off, so I'll ask you to expand on this in just a moment. But this is the sort of the counterfactual that Andrew Roberts, after sort of dismissing the ahistorical outlook of Darrell Cooper and others who are say that Hitler as the enemy is responsible as the villain of the Second World War. He says, but there's the obvious. With either Hitler or Stalin controlling all of Europe between Paris and Minsk, this is him, the world, including America, would have been in a vastly worse place than one that Churchill and Roosevelt helped fashion in 1945. Paint that picture of what a Nazi Europe would have looked like, which is the outcome that these advocates of this ahistorical sort of Churchill's a villain would seem to have said would be a preferred outcome.
Well, a huge number, or rather an even greater number, of people in the United States would lose relations. There had been obviously a vast migration of Europeans, and including European Jews, to the US in the early part of the 20th century and in the 19th century. And if Hitler had been in power, he would have succeeded in his project of exterminating all of the Jews under his authority. As it was, he managed to extinguish over 6.5 million during a very brief period of time. Commerce would have come under Nazi sway. There would have been attacks on America's interests, both strategically, militarily, and economically. The idea that this is a world in which any sort of normal American life and European civilization could survive is completely fallacious, and one can only assume one of two things. Either these men, then, who are not historians, we should say, are saying this stuff just to get attention, or they are so addled by the current political situation in the US and so determined to burnish their ultra-isolationist America First credentials that they want to come up with the most absurd counterfactual argument that Churchill is a villain and that Churchill shouldn't have fought Hitler and that actually we should have continued to appease Hitler. Well, that was the argument of the American fascists at the time. That was the argument of Lindbergh. That was the argument of the anti-Semitic US ambassador to London, the father of the future president, Joseph P. Kennedy.
Who loved, as you note, tried to dismiss Winston Churchill as the drunk and tried to sort of through that report tried to ensure that FDR and Churchill, Churchill's not worthy of working with FDR and an alliance with the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. He absolutely poisoned the well, or tried to poison the well, of Anglo-American relations. Fortunately, he failed. Fortunately, FDR knew that he was a bounder, and one of the reasons for appointing him to London was to get him out of the way. But then he became even more of a liability than he did in America.
Well, I think the best payback for the Nazi sympathizing Joe Kennedy was that his son became president of the United States, an avid Democrat, a promoter of freedom, and someone who saw great value in alliances. And so that was, I think, some poetic justice for his misguided outlook. You begin, the quote that starts your book and that you select from Churchill is one that I think, I'd love you to comment on, and I think really goes to the crux of what you are capturing in this moment of history, this consequential moment of history, and what is sort of a lasting legacy that we ought not to forget. And that is, this is a quote, "There is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them." That is a Churchill quote. Talk about how that runs throughout your book, I mean, including Stalin's Soviet Union. And then the perils of perhaps forgetting the significance of this quote as we look at the world today and the challenges to the free world.
Well, quite frankly, Britain couldn't have won the Second World War without allies, and actually nor could the United States. The United States needed Britain, if just at a bare minimum, as a launch pad from which to liberate the continent of Europe. It would have been impossible to send an invasion fleet straight from New Jersey to the Normandy beaches. The point of that quotation is that there were very many moments during the Second World War when Churchill was exasperated or depressed by what some of his allies were doing. He was fighting with the Americans about the future of the British Empire. He was fighting with the Americans about the financing of the war and a frankly fairly avaricious policy pursued by the US Treasury under Henry Morgenthau, which denuded Britain of all her gold reserves, all her dollar reserves, and was coming after the remnants of British trade at the same time. Even more significantly, he was at odds with Stalin over his desire to control all of the territory which he had controlled, and probably more some, through his pact with Hitler. That is, Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Eastern Romania. But one task at the time. It was Bismarck who said that politics is the art of the possible, and the task at that time was to defeat a far more aggressive and a far more reckless power than the Soviet Union. When people say, oh, aren't they just as bad? Nazism and communism, weren't they just the same? Well, yes, if you were living in the Soviet Union, but for anyone else, the Soviet Union certainly before 1939 was a far more cautious, far less expansionist power than the Nazi state. What the United States proved after 1945 with its allies, with NATO, was that the Soviet Union could be contained. And Hitler maybe could have been contained had there been alliances which had shown greater backbone than there had been in the 1930s. So the essence of the Churchill quotation is realizing that there are greater goods in this world, there are greater moral goods, there are greater strategic goods, and that you sometimes have to subliminate your own particular selfish national interests for the greater good. Because also the greater good for the world, when you're talking about world commerce and pluralistic values and everything else, is also in your own interest. And that would be my great challenge to America first, both in the 1930s, early 40s, and now, which is to say that it's oxymoronic, in my view, to say that what is good for the world is not good for America. Generally, what is good for the rest of the world is also very good for America, the world's leading power, God bless her.
Amen to that. And I think what's good for America is often good for the world. The flip side as well. Interesting on this, on Stalin, that's and the USSR and them being part of the alliance. At what point does Churchill sort of move away after Yalta or during Yalta, and then seeing Stalin for what he is, and then comes a couple of years later to Fulton, Missouri, and gives the speech saying the Iron Curtain speech. Is that something that was always there, but he was waiting for the right moment to share it, because the first sort of business needed to be concluded, that is the defeat of Nazism, or was there sort of a hard shift?
Well, Churchill was the most famous anti-Bolshevik that there could possibly be. He was the man who wanted to strangle the Russian Revolution at birth, and then in the 1920s used to inveigh against the foul baboonery of Bolshevism. But again, he saw the greater good, and it was, I think, one of the most significant things about Churchill is that long before he even got into government, let alone became prime minister, he was advocating in the 1930s a democratic British-French Soviet alliance to contain Hitler. Mm-hmm. It didn't happen because people in the Conservative Party were not prepared to realize that there was a greater danger than communism at this particular moment. During the Second World War, Churchill doesn't lose this anti-Bolshevism, but he does have moments of optimism in dealing with Stalin. He allows himself to believe that he has gained an element of influence over the Soviet dictator, but then that fluctuates. It really oscillates between rarely just justified optimism and extreme pessimism. And he says in 1945 that there's very little he can do to prevent Eastern Europe from being Bolshevized, and he's incredibly depressed about it. He says during the Tehran conference, that's the first time the big three have been together in 1943, he says that he thinks that there will be another world war after this one, an ideological world war. So he does have more lucid moments about Stalin and the Soviet Union's intentions, I think, than moments of delusional optimism. FDR, on the other hand, really, I think, does believe a lot of the time that he can work with Stalin and that the Soviet Union is going to be so desperate for American largesse, American credits for reconstruction at the end of the war, and that he will be able to work his FDR magic, which has taken him to the White House for an unprecedented fourth time, to persuade Stalin at some great big conference at the end of the war that this is how the world should be organized. And the naivety I think that he shows is once a Red Army soldier has set foot on a particular square foot of territory in Europe, it's going to be very hard to get them out. And no amount of persuasion and no amount of good conference diplomacy is going to change that.
I mean, the power personality, the confidence personality that allowed these leaders to stare down Nazism in some respects was also, the same sort of delusional quality that could accommodate Stalin. But there was sort of the brass tacks of it all, which was how many Soviet boots on the ground were there in Poland? I mean, you were not going to dislodge them short of a battle. I mean, I think Churchill contemplates this, but it's just not really available to them at this time in the war.
Yeah, in May of 1945, just as the war is ending, Churchill orders the British Chiefs of Staff to come up with a war plan which would see British and American tanks and German manpower driving the Red Army back to the Soviet Union's pre-war frontiers. But the operation is quite rightly codenamed Operation Unthinkable. It's completely unthinkable. Even if the British and the Americans could have pushed the Soviets back at that stage, as the British Chiefs of Staff point out, there's nothing to stop Stalin continuing to retreat all the way to Moscow, and suddenly it's the British and the Americans that are freezing to death around the Russian capital, not the Germans. But also, this is one of the reasons why there's great difficulty now in confronting imperialist revanchist powers, just as there was then. If you're a democracy, you have to have the buy-in of the people. And the people in Britain, the people in the United States, had been told for 3 years and very willingly believed that Stalin was our great ally. And the Red Armies were the heroes who had driven the Germans back from Moscow and back from Stalingrad. So there was absolutely no possibility of fighting the Soviets.
That's a great point. So you take the pragmatic approach to alliances to defeat the greater challenge, the greater enemy, in this case, Nazism. But then the population is there, and you can't walk them back from sort of the argument tipped in propaganda, and now say, no, Stalin's the adversary. But indeed, ultimately, Churchill's point of view was reinforced. What he saw in Stalinism, the United States and the rest of the free world will come to see and appreciate through his brutality. It took decades to get there, but it happened. I mean, 1988, you begin to see with Gorbachev them finally withdrawing Russian forces or Soviet forces from Eastern Europe.
Absolutely. And containment was a joint Anglo-American strategy. And it's very interesting. Once wartime levels of propaganda have stopped and censorship, criticism of the Soviet Union is no longer suppressed, how swiftly both the American and British public move towards hostility towards the Russians, not because of anything inherent in them, but because of what they are doing in Eastern Europe.
So when I was reading your book and naturally thinking about counterfactuals, the what ifs, which I don't know if that offends you as a historian or if you're occasionally indulge in playing these games.
We all love a good what if.
Okay. Well, so let's indulge for a moment here, Tim. We're with Tim Bouverie, who is the author of Allies at War, How the Struggles Between the Allied Powers Shaped the War and the World, published by Crown. Go get it on Amazon or wherever you get your books. Here's a counterfactual. Let's just say FDR was more persuasive and more capable in turning domestic opinion in the United States prior to 1941. Pick your year. We'll call it 1939 or 1940. Let's say that the isolation of the America Firsters, the Republicans who were suspicious, deeply suspicious of entanglement in other foreign wars, actually saw the threat that Hitler and Nazism posed to the United States. And the alliance came together then, not in the drip way it did up until Pearl Harbor, but in a robust fashion where the kind of the power of the American economy could be devoted, and you have that front with the British and perhaps the French too. In other words, let's just say you had a post-World War II construct between in 1939, 1940 in Europe. What would that look like?
Well, there are so many variables. One big question is, in this construct, has the German army invaded the Soviet Union? Is the Soviet Union a player or not? If the Soviet Union is a player and America comes into the war a year earlier, it changes the whole potential for what the post-World War could look like, in that with America in earlier, it would have been possible to cross the Channel earlier. And if the British and the Americans can cross the Channel earlier, then they can get to Central and Eastern Europe before the Red Army, and suddenly the advantage lies with them. Another counterfactual is that it is, if the Soviet Union is not involved in the war yet, Hitler would have to be even more foolhardy than he ultimately is to get involved with the Soviet Union while he's still dealing with the British and the Americans, and this is going to mean that the war goes on for a lot longer, and there are very many more American and British bodies on the ground. And then at the end of it, there is the possibility that America withdraws from Europe, and there is this void which an unbloodied Soviet Union is able to fill because it's not been involved in the war. So there are myriad involvements, but would it generally have been for the better if America had been more internationalist, more committed to the alliance, more committed to deterring aggression before just waiting for an attack? And this is obviously the ultimate proof against isolationism. Isolationism just didn't work. America was attacked. America was brought into the Second World War. Isolationism did not protect America. Then yes, I think it would have been undoubtedly better. The great flaws of the Western strategy, probably the greatest problem with Western strategy post the First World War, was that America wasn't involved. America wasn't a power in the League of Nations. America wasn't helping contain the Japanese until late on in the Far East, or the Germans and the Italians in Europe.
The salient lesson that the U.S. took after the Second World War, in bipartisan fashion, was just that America needs to lead in the world, that it needs to lead with allies, and if you do so, you can deter adversaries who will always be there, be it the Soviet Union or the challenges and the adversaries that have emerged afterwards, now the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union. And the alliances, the big takeaway, I'd love for you to comment on this, is such that constant management is needed. that is riddled with suspicion and tension and challenges, but we are better off with them, as a quote at the outset from Churchill says, than without them. And it seems to be, as we experienced during the Cold War, the best bet on preventing warfare. In other words, this is the best means towards deterrence.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. And another way of looking at it, and the justification to Americans who wonder why this should be, at a philosophical level, is what Churchill said in 1943 when he was given an honorary degree at Harvard University. And he just said, greatness confers responsibility. America dodged its global responsibilities after the First World War, and it wasn't for the better of America, and it wasn't for the better of the world. I say it wasn't for the better of America because if America had acknowledged its role in the world post-1918, then it is possible that those 500,000 American soldiers need not have died in the Second World War, and huge amounts of treasure, as well as all that blood, would not have been lost. And yes, alliances are infuriating. Everyone's got their own national interests. Personalities clash. It is the nature of diplomacy to try and get around these. My whole book is about how difficult these alliances are and how infuriating allies can be and how infuriating multinational bodies can be, how difficult it can be to work with the League of Nations in the 1930s or the United Nations now. But it is the work of minutes to get rid of these alliances, to denigrate your allies, to lose the goodwill, to undermine the moral and political platforms on which they rest. But it's the work of decades, and often extremely arduous decades tending to involve wars, to build them up. And we take these alliances for granted at our peril.
You know, and I agree with all of that. And at the same time, I think there's value and utility for everybody involved to shake them up from time to time and to not allow them to get lazy or just to be dictated by inertia. And here I'm zooming forward to today. I mean, look at NATO and President Trump, certainly his first term in office and to a degree in his second term in office, has been a skeptic of many of our NATO allies for not being adequately committed to the defense of their own countries and then more broadly committed to investing in NATO. And at times that has been expressed in the form of dismissing the entire alliance. But more recently, it's been saying, no, you have to step up and every partner needs to do its piece. And many in NATO for years have not. I think that's also sort of allowing space within alliance structures to have these spats, to have the debate and the fight over who is doing what, who's taking responsibility, who's stepping up, I think is also called for. And of course, you know, as a result now we have more of our NATO allies, particularly in continental Europe, committed to their own defense in a way that they haven't been for decades.
Undoubtedly that's the case, and you're completely right, and Europe has been shamefully irresponsible in not maintaining her defences over the last 20, 30 years. And President Trump is entirely right to criticise Europe for that, and Europe has been appallingly dilatory. I couldn't agree more. I think in general it is better for diplomacy like this, and it could be robust diplomacy, to take place not in the public sphere.
Yes.
And because it creates lasting resentments and it alienates populations. This should be between leaders and your own institution. Ronald Reagan, and his relationship with Margaret Thatcher, they could have some extremely robust discussions behind closed doors. They didn't allow them to leak out into the press very often. And the other particular reason for that is, while on the one hand, President Trump's actions have succeeded in galvanizing the Europeans to commit more to defense, it has also cast doubt on the efficacy of NATO. It has cast doubt in the minds of people, including NATO members, but even more importantly, potential NATO adversaries, most obviously Russia, as to whether or not the United States is committed to the alliance, and if a NATO country is invaded by Russia or whoever, whether the United States will be there. And it's the old deterrence argument. You can't have a nuclear deterrent. The Cold War wouldn't have worked if we've already let it know that we have absolutely no intention of ever pressing the button if the Soviets had pressed the button at whatever stage. That deterrence, the unity of the alliance externally, has to remain if we are to deter.
Absolutely, and you know, so much of your book in times is a discussion around Poland at different points during the Second World War. It begins that way. It ends with a discussion around Poland, and then here we are in 2025 as Russian drones penetrate Polish airspace, and the debate and discussion of whether or not NATO has responded adequately, and NATO allies came to shoot down, along with Poland, to support Poland in shooting down those drones. It is sort of shocking that we're back at this point where the center of gravity, I mean, it is Ukraine, but it's also now Poland as well, as we think about European security and the role of allies and the role of the United States. I'm not trying to overstate the matter. I'm simply describing where we are today with European security, and the echoes of the past seem to be quite present.
Very much so. And the irony is, it shouldn't be this hard. If NATO works together, if the West works together, the relative balance of power is so overwhelmingly on the West side, on NATO's side, compared to the Cold War era when there was a far more even distribution of power, or compared to the 1930s where the powers that were appeasing Hitler had very good reason to fear the destruction of their capital cities by German bombers. Those sorts of threats aren't in existence right now, although of course there is the nuclear element to Russia's capabilities. In general, Russia is a far less powerful country today than it was in any of the Cold War or decades, or Nazi Germany was in the 30s and the 40s. So it should have been easier to prevent us from coming to the situation which you've just described.
Tim Bouverie, thank you so much for joining the show. Congrats on your book, Allies at War. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Roger. It's been a great pleasure.